This is Fresh Tracks Weekly. We didn't have an episode last week because I had a file get corrupted on the camera, which was super unfortunate. It's the first time I've had that happen on one of our main cameras. Happens all the time with GoPros, but not usually our good cameras. But anyway, this week we are back at it, and we're talking about how to increase your odds of drawing a special hunting permit, using bighorn sheep as the main example. Mostly because I still just can't get my mind off of bighorn sheep. Even though I got to hunt them last year, it's still just top of mind for me. But before that, we have a few news stories that we found interesting this week. In Kentucky, a bill has passed out of committee into the Senate that could have significant consequences to Kentucky Department of Wildlife Resources and ultimately the hunters and anglers of the state. Senate Bill 3 would move the Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources to the Department of Agriculture, giving the Commissioner of Agriculture nominating power of the Fish and Wildlife Commission. Kentucky DFWR and the Department of Agriculture have vastly different goals when it comes to wildlife. This bill would give power to individuals who would be more inclined to view wildlife as a nuisance or a pest versus a huntable resource. This bill could also potentially hamstring DFWR's ability to fund projects. Normally, fish and wildlife agencies are able to leverage their own funds to receive Pittman-Robertson money, but if DFWR is under the Department of Agriculture, the potential of mingling of funds could disqualify projects' eligibility. Numerous sportsmen and conservation organizations have come out strongly against this bill, urging legislators to kill it. If you live in Kentucky and you want your voice to be heard, contact your senators. I'll put a link in the video description. The Arizona Game and Fish Commission is meeting today to potentially vote on whether or not to do away with their conservation permits. Arizona conservation permits or auction tags allow the winning bidder to hunt every unit within the state of Arizona, and they currently raise millions of dollars for species-specific conservation every year. This year, the mule deer permit was auctioned off for $725,000. The bighorn sheep permits are regularly in the $300,000 to $400,000 range. We've talked about auction tags in the past and whether or not they fit within the North American model of conservation because you're taking a public resource and selling it to the highest bidder. It seems as though each state handles how far they're willing to go down that auction or raffle tag route differently, where it seems as though most states are willing to utilize around 2 permits per species. Often one is auctioned and one goes to a raffle. Other states go a lot further, like Utah, where they raffle and auction off hundreds of tags, or Wyoming, that has a significant amount of commissioner tags. In the case of Arizona, they currently allow up to 3 tags per species to be either auctioned or raffled per year, and they also have a policy that 100% of the revenue from the auction permit goes back to the state to fund projects specific to each species. This is a much more rigid policy than a lot of states that allow a certain percentage to go back to the organization that conducted the marketing and the auction of each tag. That's why it's somewhat surprising to see this coming from Arizona because they generate a significant amount of revenue with a small number of permits. The commission meeting is happening right now, and they may or may not take action on this. We'll have to check in and see what happens next week. In Wyoming, the Game and Fish Commission just voted unanimously to pursue establishing protections for a pronghorn migration corridor. For years, there's been an effort to establish protections along a critical migration corridor utilized by the sublet pronghorn herd. The path encompasses a 165-mile route used by around 40,000 animals. The path has been extensively documented with GPS data from collared pronghorn over the last 20 years, and the route already has seen a series of obstacles including subdivisions, fence, and oil and gas developments. The recent decision was significant because for years the agency had been reluctant to place protections on the corridor, mostly from concerns from disrupting oil and gas industry operations. The majority of the comments in the public process were in support of providing protections on the corridor, with most of the ones that were opposed coming from oil and gas representatives. The commission vote does not mean that protections will go into place, but rather that the next step in the process can occur, which includes Wyoming Game and Fish preparing a biological risk assessment and the governor assembling a stakeholder group. Ultimately, the final decision will be up to the governor. In Idaho, there's been an effort to pass a bill that would end the open fields doctrine for conservation officers, essentially making it illegal for a game warden to check licenses or hunted animals on private land without a warrant. The open fields doctrine is an exception to the Fourth Amendment that allows law enforcement officers to enter open field private property without a warrant. A handful of states have rejected the open fields doctrine with differing levels of what constitutes lawful entry onto the property. The main reason this bill causes concern among sportsmen is that fish and wildlife are a public resource, and just because someone owns the land doesn't mean that they can dictate what happens to the wildlife on that land. The worry is that by restricting conservation officers' ability to enter open fields to do compliance checks, it'll enable hunters to break laws easier, knowing an officer cannot enter their property. There was a previous version of this bill that is now dead, but the current version is SB 1404 and is currently in the Senate Judiciary and Rules Committee. So if you live in Idaho and feel strongly one way or the other, you can let them know at the link in the description. In Arizona, the Nature Conservancy recently received an $11.5 million grant to purchase conservation easements in the upper Verde River watershed and Big Chino grasslands. We've talked quite a bit about conservation easements in the past and how they are a critical tool in conserving open space and wildlife habitat. In this case, it'll be the Nature Conservancy purchasing easements from willing landowners of up to 20,000 acres in a pretty amazing location. The area in question is in the upper end of the watershed of the Verde River, which is one of the last free-flowing rivers in the state. Not only does it support substantial fish and wildlife habitat, but it is also a main source of water for the Verde Valley and the Phoenix metro area. The grant that the Nature Conservancy received required a 50% match, which means that together TNC with its partners will put up the other half to make $23 million to spend on this particular mission. That's a lot of land that'll be conserved. With that, we'll jump into our deeper dive where we're talking about putting more animals on the mountain with bighorn sheep in Montana as the main example. You keep talking about, putting more animals on the mountain if you want to increase your odds of drawing a tag.
Yep.
And bighorn sheep would be one of the most perfect examples, I feel like, because they're one of the lowest odds species of actually drawing a tag.
Yeah, I've applied for a long time in a lot of states, and you know how many I've drawn?
Yeah, and I was the super lucky one who drew a tag last year. Got to kill a bighorn sheep in Montana, and I still can't get my mind off them. I still think about it constantly and what we can do to put more sheep on the mountain. And then it's a fascinating species.
Right.
And also it's a little bit top of mind because we were just at the Montana Wild Sheep Foundation banquet and seminars, which were super interesting. I got to sit through some of that and just get an update about what I learned about last year, about what they're doing in the state to make that happen. But can you elaborate a little more on put more sheep on the mountain?
Well, your hunt is a very good example. Montana had major die-offs in the late 90s, the 2000s, even through 2010. Imagine if the state and the volunteer groups hadn't went and put the amount of effort they did in that herd that you got to hunt.
Yeah.
Because back in the day, when I first moved to Montana, there was hardly any huntable sheep in that area. And now they give away, 5 or 6, I don't know what it is, 8 tags. Anyhow, it's more than it used to be. And we're trying to reestablish some of the die-off herds. It's hard because the disease is there on the landscape, and it causes you to wonder, is this really viable sheep habitat? You got all the domestic sheep, like the little hobby flocks. You got people moving here. So some people would say, well, there's not more tags every year, so we're not making any progress. Well, sometimes we think that, well, tomorrow there should be twice as many tags.
Yeah.
No, it doesn't work that way. It takes long periods of time. This is something that when you have dramatic die-offs like we had, you don't replace that overnight. But imagine if the sheep advocates, the wild sheep advocates said, nah, you know what, this is futile. Hell with it. Let's go home. We'd probably be down to almost 0 sheep in Montana right now.
Yeah, and that's the thing, because the numbers did go up, and then they've dropped back down a little bit, and it depends on the area and on the herd. But there are a few less sheep tags than there used to be.
Right.
But to me, that's all the more reason to focus on
get with it,
figuring out what's going on, and like trying to figure out what's best for each herd. And that's what Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks talked about in these seminars in Missoula that they talked about. There's just several biologists from around the state that kind of gave an update of what's going on. And then there's also the statewide adaptive management plan, the new conservation strategy, where they're trying to figure out what the issues are for the specific herd, and they have a different strategy for those specific herds to figure out like what's the priority here.
Yeah.
And so they have a number of things, like, because the big one is disease.
Right.
That when bighorn sheep and domestic sheep mix, oftentimes they get sick. The bighorns get sick and they die.
Yep.
That's at the basic level of what's going on. And so knowing that, how do you how do you keep commingling of bighorn sheep and domestic sheep from happening? And that's one of the big questions that they're trying to answer right now. And so that's one of the big efforts that's going on. Habitat, there's some places where winter range is a pretty big limiting factor for bighorn sheep. So what can they do to improve the habitat in those areas? And what can they do to conserve habitat? Conservation easements on important winter range that's on private land. That's a big tool. I know there's a big push to get a conservation easement approved just this last week. So things like that. Predation is another one. There's mountain lions that'll get on herds and they'll, knock out a whole, especially something that's like a newly augmented herd where they're not necessarily newly augmented, but it could be newly augmented or just a new population that they transplanted into the area. And sometimes lions figure that out and they just wreak havoc on them.
And you're talking about a very small population number, so that's living on probably some marginal habitat. And every study, I don't care what species it is, when you have small populations that are subjected to narrow habitat bands, predation, the amplified effect of predation is always way higher than it historically would have been if they had the whole landscape, and there were lots of them.
And to that effect, on the predation front, just while we're on it, they have put some specific efforts of getting lion hunters on those specific problem lines. Both Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks and Montana Wild Sheep have worked together to try to target those problem lines for those specific circumstances where that's happening. So that's one interesting way that hunters have been able, like very direct way that hunters have been able to help in those situations. But a few of the other things that they are working on with, depending on the herd, is introduction. So that would be just a brand new herd.
Right.
So there's a lot of sheep habitat that's unoccupied in the state. So how do you get more sheep out there? You just introduce new herds. And so that's an exciting one. And then one that I think is super cool because it has to do with one of the herds that I got to hunt is range expansion. And so within the mountain ranges where these bighorns are living, there's a bunch of unutilized habitat that they're not using. They're just, concentrating in certain spots. And so in the herd that I hunted, they actually did this where the biologist and, it was a huge collaborative effort, but they took some of the existing herd, they captured them, put them in a truck and trailer, drove them further north into the mountain range and released them into a new area, hoping that they would recolonize some of those historic habitats where they've been known to exist. And there's also habitat models that suggest it's really good sheep habitat. And so trying to convince them to relearn those areas is pretty cool. And honestly, if you can get that to work, I think that is a really, really good way to put more sheep on the mountain, because there's just so many big mountain ranges in Montana that can support that. And the example that we have currently is the Absaroka Beartooth, where they all the way through Montana and Wyoming, you have multiple meta populations of bighorns that are doing pretty well. In fact, the action for Montana, all of the issues that they've identified for the different herds, the Absaroka Beartooth population is no action because they're doing so. I mean, again, they could always do better. There's places they could expand to, and there's probably room for more there, but there's no action needed because they're not getting these disease events that are killing them off. There's not the limiting habitat that's restricting them. They have all these different little populations, and for whatever reason, it really works to keep them alive. And so if you can recreate that in other areas, that's pretty a pretty big thing.
And we're focusing on wild sheep because it's so easy to illustrate. The number of tags is small in every state.
Right.
So if you add 10 tags, that's a lot.
Yeah.
You look at Nevada. At one time, they were down to 2,000 to 3,000 wild sheep, and now they're over 10,000. How did that happen? Well, we went down there and we watched a lot of those volunteers do that when we did that film, Selfless.
Yeah.
You look at Arizona, you get states where there are constraining factors, water in Arizona. When they had the really bad drought of 19, 20, 21, they were trucking water to these places. That was to just try keep the sheep on the mountain.
Yeah.
And in severe conditions, sometimes just maintaining is considered a victory.
Yeah.
And
Well, and it's
allows
not,
it
yeah.
to rebound when the time comes.
Yeah. Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, all those, states that waters are restricted resource for a variety of reasons that,
Yep.
you have all the wild horses there. That's a huge issue that didn't exist before. You have years of overgrazing and fire suppression that have resulted in a lot less water on the landscape.
Yep.
And so they come in and they make artificial water sources that these guzzlers or water catchments or whatever it might be to help these bighorns, and it's working. Like that helps put so much more sheep on the mountain because the other parts of the habitat are intact, but they just don't have the water.
Right.
And so that's the way that they're doing it.
Yeah.
In a lot of those states, the Nevada one was really cool. You should check out the film we made on it. We'll put a link in the description.
Yeah, and I can use Nevada as another example. When I went to college there, the statewide population objective for elk was 3,000.
Mm-hmm.
Now, through a whole bunch of effort, a bunch of advocacy, a bunch of money raised, work by the Elk Foundation, the statewide objective is 12,000. And some people might say, well, 12,000 elk, what's that? Well, that's 4 times as many as there used to be in 1985. Kentucky had 0 elk 25 years ago. Now they got 12 to 14,000. That's 500 to 700 tags that never used to be there.
Yeah.
And so you can go on and on and on of examples. I think we all get in the notion that, all this stuff was done 100 years ago. No, there are modern day, like today, right now, examples. I would bet if we come back and revisit some of this in 2 or 3 years, some of those things that the FWP management plan for wild sheep has in place, we're going to see some results to that.
Yeah.
And I know in today's world, people want to just snap their fingers and say, oh, guess what? There's twice as many elk out there, so my odds should double. No, that isn't going to happen with a snap of the fingers. But everything that we look at, using the Nevada example, using the Kentucky example, those took 20 to 30 years.
Right. It's little steps.
Right.
It's not like you don't usually get these big, massive sweeping changes. It's just like a ton of little steps to get to the end result.
Yeah. And I think somewhere along the way, we probably ought to do a piece that answers the question that very often the audience has of, well, what can I do?
Yeah.
I want to double my odds. I want twice as many animals on the mountain. What can I do? And we sit around here and talk about the laundry list of possibilities of how every person can make a difference in some way. And maybe someday we just sit down with a whole checklist of, you could do this, or you could do this, or you could do that.
Yeah, and again, it's just those little things. It's having conversations, it's volunteering, getting involved with the whatever local group that you're interested in. There's just like a lot of different things. But even just having conversations and talking about it and increasing awareness about certain things makes big projects happen. To go back to another Montana-centric bighorn sheep example, because I'm just super narrow-minded. The big one that they're doing right now is a collaborative effort with Montana wool growers, Montana wild sheep, and Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks all together. They're doing this collaborative research where they have collars on bighorn sheep and on domestic sheep, and they're trying to figure out when are these commingling events happening, like when are these bighorns going to have that interaction where they're going to get sick, and how do they prevent that? So like by having collars, because some of these sheep herds are massive, the domestic sheep herds are massive. There's thousands and thousands of sheep, and it's hard to like really get an idea. It's not like they're just in one small pasture. They're roaming entire mountain ranges. And so they have these collars on those sheep to figure out, okay, when are they encountering each other, and how do we prevent that? They're going to look into using livestock dogs as part of that. And also just like seasonal rotations of different pastures or sheep herders moving the domestics into different areas where the bighorns aren't. And so that is a super unique thing that has happened, and it's resulted from people just having conversations and like working together, because a lot of times when you have something like the livestock industry versus a nonprofit or, the Wild Sheep Foundation, they might not play well together because they have very different goals.
Right. Historically, the wild sheep advocates and the domestic sheep producers have had a struggle finding common ground.
And now they're working together, and it's pretty cool. And like I think Kurt Alt is a huge part of it. He's been a big part of wild sheep and Montana wild sheep, and he used to be an FWP biologist. But anyway, so it's just like it's cool, and they mentioned in that seminar, it's like it's pretty unique that these conversations are happening between people on the ground and not between lawyers.
Yeah, because
a lot of times it's between lawyers, and so it's cool. Like that stuff like that is happening.
Well, they asked me to give the conservation message that Friday night at that event. And one of the things I always focus on when I'm asked to do that is I asked the question, how many sheep got put on the mountain when we argued about bonus point systems? 0. How many sheep got put on the mountain when we argued about lighted knocks? 0. How many sheep got put on the mountain when we argued about what should be, the season date? 0. My point of all that is that the things that we tend to focus on because we get in this scarcity mindset of, oh, it's a shrinking resource and I got to figure out a way to get mine. It's the human condition. That's how we evolved was with a scarcity mindset. I always want people to think about, is what I'm doing, is what I'm spending my energy on actually putting more wildlife on the landscape? Now, I don't care if it's sheep, elk, pronghorn, ducks, whatever.
Yeah.
That's the real question. And we, in this discussion, we talk about wild sheep because it's so easy to illustrate what we're talking about when you're dealing with such small numbers.
Yeah, but like you said, it applies to everything, every species and habitat. And that's the thing. We can also fall into the trap, it's like I think bighorn sheep do have a lot of advocates, especially relative to the number of permits they give out. Right. Fundraising usually, fundraising is always an issue, but a lot of money is raised in the name of bighorn sheep. And there's a lot of funding that is, going towards research right now and some really cool stuff. So that's awesome, but that doesn't exist for every species. And so
no, it doesn't. Who raises money for pronghorn?
Yeah.
Who raises money for sage grouse? The list goes on and on and on. There's a lot of species out there that we don't really raise a lot of money for. Hopefully we're at least speaking on their behalf when habitat issues come up and other stuff. And I think this is the other thing. If you talk to all those biologists you referenced and others, we are at that point where habitat is what the focus has to be.
Yeah.
In a period of time where we have huge population increases moving to the Rockies or moving to other what have been wildlife friendly locations where abundant wildlife exists, tons of people are moving there. It's fracturing and disrupting that habitat. So are we going to make these long-term investments? Habitat investment is a long-term investment.
For sure. And you don't see the results instantly.
No.
The only results you see instantly is when you destruct habitat.
Yeah, that's instant.
So that's like, but like trying to bring it back and conserve, or, conserving is this, trying to keep the destruction from happening. But then,
So I think when people think it's kind of tongue in cheek when I say, oh, well, if you want to double your odds, put twice as many animals out there. It is somewhat tongue in cheek, but it's also absolute fact. If you want a 10% increase in your odds, what if we could put, 30 more wild sheep on the mountain? What if we could put, 4,000 more elk on the landscape? What if we could put 5,000 more pronghorn on the landscape? We're not talking about huge effort to do that. What would that do to us? It'd help us all.
For sure.
So that's going to require money, going to require advocacy, going to require habitat, and we're the ones. It's on us. There's no one else coming to the rescue for wildlife. It is the hunting community. Others can say that, but nobody shows up with their checkbooks and with their votes on behalf of wildlife the way that hunters do. So don't be looking around saying, where are the backups? Where's the second string coming in to give me a rest? We're it. Real question is, are we going to do it or not?
Yeah. I don't know what I can say to add more than that. That was very well put.
So, yeah. Thanks, Marcus.
Yeah, thank you.